Well, good morning. My name is James Latwell. I'm the Executive Vice President, Mystery Writers America, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Edgar Symposium. This is the 80th Annual Edgar Awards, and it's been a tradition to bring many of our nominees, yes, 80 years. It's been a tradition to bring our nominees together so you can help celebrate their accomplishments. I mean, it's a huge honor to be a nominee as an Edgar nominee or any of our special awards. And you'll have a chance to meet some of those fantastic authors today during the symposium. And hopefully you'll be with us tomorrow night when you can see who walks away with one of our Edgar Awards or our special awards, the Sue Grafton Award, Mary Higgins Clark, Lillian Jackson Braun, or the Robert L. Fish Award. We'll cap off the day today with a Grandmaster interview with Lee Child and Donna Andrews, led by our very own Raven Award winner, Oline Cogdell. There'll be time for questions after the panels. Please make sure it is in the form of a question, and it's not about you. It's about our nominees. And a huge thank you to Marjorie Flax for keeping the symposium going. It was tough going after they had to close these down after the pandemic, but we're back again this year. So we owe Marjorie a big round of applause for that. Also, I'd like to thank Chris Monty, Kelly Nichols, and Kathy Daneman, who pulled the program content together for you today. And a huge thanks to our MWA board. We have a fantastic board this year, and we've done a lot for our members, and we hope to do even more in the future. Our first panel is going to commence very shortly, and it's Murder by Death, where art, crime, and literature intersect, moderated by our very own Edgar Award-winning author, Alison Gaylin. And we hope you enjoy the symposium. A couple of quick housekeeping items. I think you've already seen where the snacks and coffee and tea are. Restrooms are right down that same hallway. The hotel has asked us to make sure we remind folks no outside food or drink is allowed because they are imposing a financial penalty on us if there is, which we will gladly pass on to you. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a fun time during the day, and I'll turn it over to Allison.
So I'm so happy to be here with these tremendously talented writers. We've got a great panel. I'm just going to read a bio of each of them before we start so you can actually hear how great they are. First of all, Amanda Chapman. Amy Pershing is her actual name. I'm probably gonna call her Amanda because that's what it says. So she's a lifelong mystery lover and wordsmith, and according to Elizabeth Gilbert, author of City of Girls and Eat, Pray, Love, a wonderful and clever author, is the author of Mrs. Christie at the Mystery Guild Library under the pen name Amanda Chapman. After a varied career as an editor in New York City, a journalist in Rome, Italy, and the head of employee communications at a global bank, she turned to writing mysteries full-time. Her first series, The Cape Cod Foodie Mysteries, prompted a starred Kirkus review, which is really hard to get, hailing it as a winner for both foodies and mystery mavens. Then, as an enthusiastic fan of traditional Golden Age mysteries and of modern-day New York City, she found herself wondering, what if someone were to recreate Agatha Christie's personal library, even to the furnishings and architecture in New York City? What would happen in that space? And thus, Mrs. Christie at the Mystery Guild Library, the first in a new series, was born. Alison Epstein is a historical fiction author who is passionate about making stories from the past accessible, inclusive, and exciting. Her most recent novel, Fagin the Thief, received the 2026 National Jewish Book Award for Fiction and the ALA's Sophie Brody Medal, and is a finalist for the 2026 Edgar Award for Best Novel, a 2026 Illinois Reads Pick, and an honor book for the 2026 AGL Jewish Fiction Awards. Her previous books include the Elizabeth Elizabethan spy thriller A Tip for the Hangman, and the Russian folklore-inspired Let the Dead Bury the Dead. She's also the author of Dirtbags Through the Ages, a bi-weekly Substack newsletter. She's diversity. This is key here. Bi-weekly Substack newsletter featuring whimsically terrible people from history. Just really sounds fantastic. A Michigan native, Allison now lives in Chicago, where she enjoys good theater, bad puns, and fancy jackets. Andrew Klavan is the New York Times best-selling author of such crime novels as True Crime, filmed by Clint Eastwood, Don't Say a Word, film starring Michael Douglas, Empire of Lies, and When Christmas Comes. He has been nominated for the Mystery Writers of America's Edgar Award 6 times and has won twice. He wrote the screenplays to A Shock to the System, which starred Michael Cain, and One Missed Call, which starred Edward Burns. His political satire videos have been viewed by tens of millions of people, and he currently hosts the popular podcast, The Andrew Klavan Show, at the Daily Wire. He is also the author of the USA Today bestseller, The Truth and Beauty, How the Lives and Works of England's Greatest Poets Point the Way to a Deeper Understanding of the Words of Jesus, and the New York Times bestseller, The Kingdom of Cain, Finding God in the Literature of Darkness, which is the book that's nominated here. A fan club. C.M. Kushins, whose name is Chad, actually, so I'm not going to call him CM, is the author of Nothing's Bad Luck, The Lives of Warren Zevon, and Beast, John Bonham, and the Rise of Led Zeppelin. His most recent book, Cooler Than Cool, The Life and Work of Elmore Leonard, has been selected as a Michigan Notable Book for 2025, as well as was selected by The New Yorker as one of the best books of the year. He has been a freelance journalist for over 20 years, and his work has appeared in High Times and The Daily Beast, among others. And Richard Kopley, sorry, I skipped over you and went to the end, but saving the best for last. Richard Kopley, Distinguished Professor of English Emeritus at Penn State Dubois, is the author of the critical biography Edgar Allan Poe, A Life, as well as the formal Center of Literature, Explorations from Poe to the Presence, Edgar Allan Poe and the Dupin Mysteries, and The Threads of the Scarlet Letter, a study of Hawthorne's transformative art. He's also the editor of Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and an editor of Edgar Allan Poe in 20 Objects from the Susan Jaffe Teen collection, and Poe Writing Poe. So he knows his Poe. Richard has served as president of the Poe Studies Association and the Nathaniel Hawthorne Society. He has received a Virginia Humanities Fellowship, a Fulbright Specialist Awards, and the Poe Studies Association's J. Lastly Dameron Award for Outstanding Poe Bibliography or Essay Collection, and its Lifetime Achievement and Service Award. He was a keynote speaker at the Poe Hawthorne Conference in Paris in July 2025, and he has also published short stories and children's picture books. So again, not to very diverse collection but a lot of Poe. I think I just said Poe more times than they're going to say it in this entire symposium and Edgar Awards. So it's interesting. We have two authors who here, Chad and Richard, who have covered the lives of very, very prolific authors. It's a real challenge to do that. I wanted to ask Chad first. Have you always been a fan of Elmore Leonard? And also, what made you decide to tackle this very long and extremely prolific life?
Thank you. This is on, right? Is this the
yes,
right
yeah, that's on. Mm-hmm.
Elmore has been my personal hero since I'm 11 years old. I discovered his books thanks to my late mom, who would bring them home from the library, and she was the avid reader in the house, so that was what got me going. At that age, you don't really get the nuances and the humor, but I do know that even from that age, it felt like reading him was like watching a movie in my mind, and I loved that. It made me want to be a writer. And I wrote to him when I was 15 with a short story I had written, and he wrote back. and proofread it. And he was one of the nicest men imaginable, so he had a fan for life.
He proofread it.
He proofread it, yeah. And the University of South Carolina is where I donated it, but he had proofread what I wrote, and as a gift, he sent along his first draft right off of his typewriter, the famous yellow paper, his short story Sparks for Otto Penzler that he had just completed. And in his letter to me, he said, pay attention how fast I get to the action, notice that there's no exposition, and that was a master class at a very young age. And I was able to use his correspondence to get my first internship at a newspaper at 16. So I ended up getting into nonfiction, but he remained like a true north of what quality writing was. And only one short story of mine was ever published online, but I have a congratulations from him. And it's not until many years later that his archive, which is at the University of South Carolina, that I look at his day planner. He was very busy when he was writing to me. I didn't think anybody could take the time to do something like that. He cleared his schedule to answer. And this is amazing to me because at the time, he had something like 12 grandchildren already. Why be nice to someone else's kid? That's just who he was. I have had the two books that you had mentioned, but I always wanted to write about him based on that experience and based on the fact that learning about his life makes you want to write. And it makes you want to be a better writer just by looking at his habits and his passions. And I thought that this is an author who is very deserving of a serious biography, considering what his output was. He may not have been very pompous about his legacy. He didn't like that word. But considering the amount of materials he saved, he knew a biography was going to happen. And when I did have the honor of getting to meet with his family to get approval and to get their assistance with it, they did agree. They said, Dad saved all these things because one way or the other there was going to be a book. But I selected him mainly because I wanted to write about someone that I related to more than the rock stars, even as much as I love them. But also,
You're not like John Bonham? Or
yeah, and I had his kids laughing when I said this. I said, he's a rock star to me, but there's no controversy because he didn't ride a motorcycle up and down a hotel. You know, you don't have those same issues. So the challenge was writing about someone who was a very nice person and whose whole life was pretty much a creative life where he would want to sit and want to write. But it was interesting that you brought that up because he was very prolific, and the real challenge was condensing how much of that career would go into a biography. So I had to select the things that I think were the turning points in his creative life and emphasize those. But I hope that answers it.
Yeah,
but
it does.
But I still use his methods for writing as far as writer's block means you got up from your desk. Yeah. Still putting in as much of a 9 to 5 as I possibly could. That was his method, is if you're taking it seriously, it's a job. Whether you're an artist or not, this is your job. And that kind of stayed with me. So putting that point into a biography, the feedback I've gotten is that a lot of writers related to that. And the biggest compliment, the two compliments I got is someone would read the book and they would say, now I want to go read all his books again, which makes me so happy. And also they would say, now this makes me want to sit down and write. And I think that was the point of his life, because that's what he had drilled into me at a young age, and I wanted the bio to be about that.
You follow the 10 rules?
Yeah, I do. Before he had put them on paper, many of those were peppered throughout his correspondence, so I had tried to memorize them first. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really interesting. Like Chad, Richard, you had quite a life to tackle. You obviously have an expansive knowledge and interest in Poe just from your biography alone. The book itself is, very expansive and fascinating. And I'm wondering, you obviously did a lot of research for this book specifically. What type of research did you do to add on your already, knowledge of Poe? And what discovery that you made in your research and that you used for this book surprised you the most?
Thank you. I did a lot of research in libraries, in archives. Library of Virginia was very important. Library of Congress was very important. I also did a lot of collecting. And the collecting was critical, of course, Online research is also valuable, but it was the collecting, I think, that led to my most exciting find. In 1992, I was told of a collection relating to Poe that was available, but I would have to make the call. So I made the call, and the woman really didn't, I think, know what she had, but she was willing to sell it, and so I bought it sight unseen. And when I received it, I looked at it, and I realized this was just too immense. I didn't have the time for it, so I hid it. I hid it, and I found it 20 years later, and I said, oh my God, that's the box that I've been ignoring all these years. And I took it out and started to transcribe the letters, and it turned out they were letters from the stepdaughter of Poe's best friend, written in 1908. She knew what she was talking about. She was telling stories of Poe that I had never heard, that were in no biography. The earliest one, which was very exciting, was Poe at 2 years old. I mean, who would imagine such a story would still exist? A new story. His mother had been dying. Two ladies from Richmond took care of her, and she died, and she had been very concerned about her two children. Her older son had already been taken by the grandparents, and these women promised to take the two children. One of them was Mrs. Allan, John Allan's wife, and one of them was Mrs. Mackenzie. And John Allan's wife had no children, so she was given the choice, and she said, I'll take the boy. And so Mrs. Mackenzie took the girl, Poe's sister. And what happened is that on December 26, 1811, there was a fire in the Richmond Theater. And at that time, John Mackenzie is the boy, Poe's friend. His parents were going to the theater. But John had just gotten a new bed. He's 5 years old. He's jumping up and down on the bed. He falls on the floor. He breaks his arm. So they give their tickets to the theater to the cousins. And they're trying to work with John, who's screaming and in pain. And the cousins come back and they say, everybody burned to death. Now, not everybody didn't, but 72 people did. It's a very famous event, and the building is still there. It's not the original building. It was a church, and it's called Monumental Church. It's built on that site. He was not allowed to play with his friends because they were afraid that he'd re-injure his arm. But there was this little 2-year-old. What trouble could he cause? And they said, yes, you could play with this little boy. His name is Edgar Poe. And so Edgar would come and visit the injured John, and John said, okay, let's tell stories. Let's compete to tell the best fairy tale. And Edgar, who's 2 years old, says, okay. He's verging on 3. John is 5. So John tells this terrific fairy tale, and Poe says, okay. And he goes him one better. This boy who's 2, barely 3. And John says, wait. And he does another fairy tale, even better than his first. And again, Edgar goes him one better. And John was astounded. And as John was recuperating, they would walk around the neighborhood competing to tell fairy tales, and Edgar would always win. This is, I think, the first indication that this fellow had an astounding imagination.
That's interesting. I also wanted to ask, how old were you when you read your first Edgar Allan Poe? And was it the literature that sort of struck you first, or how did that, kind of translate?
These are the first 3 Poe associations I have. When I was about 6, I remember author cards. And Poe was in the author cards. Louise May Alcott, Charles Dickens. There was Poe. He had this very unusual face. Okay. Second time was, I was sick. I was about 10 years old. My mother got me a book at a Woolworth's of boys' adventure stories. And in that book was the Gold Bug. And the Gold Bug was just extraordinary, between the pirates and the hidden treasure and the secret code. My goodness, it was fabulous. And then in 9th grade, I had a teacher, and she liked me to tell her this in later years, who wowed me with The Fall of the House of Usher. And what I remember is that I couldn't believe the vocabulary. For instance, there was the word phantasmagorical. And I thought, who knows how to use that word? Why wouldn't you just say fantastic? Phantasmagorical. And so I remembered that, even till now, how astounding the vocabulary was. Those are 3 early experiences.
That's great. Yeah, I was just, my dad introduced me to Edgar Allan Poe's books when I was, when I was probably like 10 or around there. And I remember being interviewed by somebody, and I said, my dad introduced me to Edgar Allan Poe. And she's like, how did your father know Edgar Allan Poe? And I was like, how old do you think I am? So, anyway.
Allison, you remind me of one quick story. Someone said, a woman said, what do you do? I said, I work on Edgar Allan Poe. She said, well, what do you do to him?
I know. Why do people get so confused over Edgar Allan Poe? I don't know. It's his legacy, I think. So, Andrew, your book is really fascinating. It examines so many books and movies that I love through a biblical lens, through the lens of the first murder, which is Cain and Abel. It's such an interesting and unique idea. And then I noticed that before that, you had written a book about the New Testament and Jesus and how that inspired poetry. I'd like to ask you about the experience of writing those two books and what inspired you in the first place to write it. It seems like you were involved in crime fiction before you were involved in Bible studies. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting combination. Many years ago, I was at a wedding, and the pastor came up to me and asked me what I did for a living, and I said, I write murder mysteries. And she said, so you make a living exploiting the worst in people? And I said, yeah, and a really good living, too. Because I don't feel that that's what I do at all. I actually feel that mystery writing and crime writing is a noble profession. And I kind of wanted to get at that. I wanted to talk about why I think that is. So I took four famous murders that have inspired movies and novels and philosophies and all kinds of things, and just examined what happens when something evil goes through the creative process, which I consider basically a good. I mean, I consider creativity to be a beautiful thing that is, a gift of love, really, where you're trying to produce something out of yourself for other people to see and to love. And so, I took the terrible crimes like the Ed Gein murders in the 1950s, where Gein would kill women or dig up their bodies and use their bodies as clothes. He would turn their bodies so he could dress up as a woman. And that inspired Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs are all inspired by Ed Gein. And those movies created the slasher pick, which is an entire genre. So all of this stuff came out of him. And I just wanted to point out that even though, of course, there were exploitative movies and ugly movies, there's a reason that a murder touches a creator's mind and brings it forward. And I think that, in terms of what you were talking about the other book, The Truth and Beauty, which is basically exploring, as the idea of God sort of goes out of the center of Western society, what poets write about that, and why you can understand their poetry better, you can understand Shakespeare better as a guy writing about these experiences. And I think that that's kind of gone out of literary criticism. People don't talk about the fact that creativity is a spiritual act, that most of the writers who have written through history were living in a world of faith and belief very different from our world. And so nobody examines it from that point of view. You're not actually allowed to talk about that. And if you go to colleges now where people can take an English degree and get a degree in English without reading Shakespeare at all, they're missing so much of the spiritual journey of Western society. So I just wanted to capture the fact that even in a slasher film, you can find something about people's relationship to the spiritual world. And yes, I see it from a Christian point of view, but I still, every week, get the letter, you call yourself a Christian, how can you write about these terrible things? And I thought maybe I could answer that by exploring these murders, including the murder of Abel by Cain, that have just inspired book after book after movie, some of which, like Silence of the Lambs and Psycho, are great films.
Absolutely, and there are some definitely horrifying scenes in the Bible. So it's kind of interesting that people would.
That's always my first response. Have you ever read the Bible?
Yeah, I mean, there's like way worse stuff than. probably any of us, right? I think that's really fascinating. Just one quick follow-up question. What do you think it was about the Ed Gein murders that inspired so much fiction?
Well, I think it was capturing this kind of gender confusion, which has been in the Western mind since Shakespeare. I mean, in Shakespeare, men and women are always dressing up as one another, and the question is always being asked by Shakespeare, is there something that is a woman that doesn't matter what she's wearing? Is there something that is a man that doesn't matter what he's wearing? And I think this guy caught something in the imagination of the 1950s, which we usually look on as a very buttoned-down time. And I think it just ignited that buried thing. And artists have never dropped that ball. They've never stopped writing about it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Allison, you took a character that all of us knew and made him the star of a book, Fagin. And the thing that really struck me about your book is, although it's about this Dickensian character, it's written in a very compelling, modern, exciting style that feels very current. I mean, so I'm interested in, first of all, what inspired you to write about Fagin? And secondly, were you ever tempted to write it in a Dickensian style?
Yes. So for what first inspired me, I just want to thank Richard for reminding me of author's cards, which I haven't thought about in a really long time, and I'm remembering the Dickens card there too. So that was probably my first early introduction to Dickens, but my first introduction to Oliver Twist in Fagin was actually the Broadway musical. I'm a big theater fan, and so when I was 9 or 10 years old, I went with my family to a touring production of Oliver, and I was like, oh, that Fagin character is the best. He's got the best songs, he's the funniest, he steals the scene every time he walks on stage, and little 10-year-old me was like, this unproblematic character who everybody likes. Fagin, perfect. And then I grew up, and I think it was about in 9th grade, I took my parents' copy of Oliver Twist off the bookshelf, and I thought, I'm probably old enough to read this, and I remember really liking Fagin. I'm sure Dickens did too. Let me read this book. And it was a very different experience for anybody who's read Oliver Twist. Dickens refers to Fagin as almost exclusively the ugly old Jew. He calls him the Jew 280 some times rather than using his name. And at this point, I grew up in a relatively small town in Michigan where I was one of maybe 4 Jewish families. And so it felt very personal and very targeted and very irritating while I was reading that book. But I think I came in Team Fagin from the beginning. And so I was reading sort of between and in and around the lines of what Dickens gave me, looking for this character that I still sort of loved. And because I was the most biased reader imaginable, I still, I think, found something in that character to like and admire and root for. And as I, grew in my time as a historical fiction novelist and a writer, I had always sort of had that character in the back of my mind that I saw, that I knew other people weren't seeing. And I thought, that there's a story in there that he could tell. There's an entire life that Dickens is not giving this man, because that's not the story he's telling, that's not the book he's writing. And what I wanted was somebody else to write that book so I could read it and enjoy it and then move on with my life, but I didn't see it. And so eventually I wrote to my agent and I said, I think I have to write that Fagin book. Do you think that's okay? And she said, go ahead and do it. And so that's how we ended up here. And I did really wrestle with, especially in revisions, how much of Dickens did I want to have not in the book, but in my voice as an author. That was a question and a challenge for me. And in the early drafts of the book, it was much more Dickensian. You can imagine I read a lot of Dickens in preparation for this book. And the more time you spend with Charles Dickens, the more you sort of have him whispering in the back of your mind until you're describing everything like Dickens. It makes you very hard to be around at your day job, I will tell you that. But as I kept writing it started to feel like I was doing a Dickens pastiche. It felt like I was putting on a costume as Dickens and pretending to be him, and that didn't feel comfortable to me, and it felt like I was setting myself up for a comparison that I was going to lose in a competition between me and Charles Dickens of who can be the most Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens will win. And so as I kept working through it with my editor, we sort of settled on something that would evoke Dickens but not resemble Dickens. And so I wanted to capture the atmosphere of a Dickensian novel, and I wanted to capture kind of the complicated character dynamics, but I did want this to read like historical fiction written by a person living in 2026. And so that's sort of where we ended up.
Yeah, and I think the result is you make this character, fully developed and accessible to people today that might not normally even pick up a Dickens book. It's just very lively style. It's interesting. I have a very similar experience with Fagin. I loved him too. I'm Jewish too. I didn't know. And my daughter actually was in The Merchant of Venice. She played Shylock, and she loved Shylock, and she couldn't understand,
I feel like I get
she did a
along with
great
your
job.
daughter.
Yeah, I know. When she was a kid, she was doing a Shakespeare. Anyway, yeah.
Dickens apologized for that depiction.
Yeah.
There's an elaborate story. So Dickens did receive letters from one Jewish reader in particular that said, you hold yourself up as this magnificent social reformer, and then you wrote this incredible anti-Semitic caricature. How do you square those things in your mind? And Dickens actually, in his response to her, was extremely defensive and said, well, all criminals of that kind were Jewish at the time. What did you want me to do? But he then sort of sat with it, and they exchanged several letters. And then in later Dickens works, in Our Mutual Friend, he then went on to write another Jewish character, Mr. Raya, who has never done a wrong thing in his life ever. This is the most beset Jewish man who is just there to help everybody, and his life is terrible, but he never thinks a cruel thought about anybody, and I find him incredibly boring and irritating, so, but you can see him trying, you can see him thinking through it. I don't think he ever got quite to the point that Jewish people are people and they are complex in the same way that non-Jewish people are, but he was working in that direction, which is nice to see.
Admirable for the time period, at any rate. Amy, Amanda. So you, I'm going to ask you about about a temptation as well. You wrote this really interesting, funny book. It's set in the present day, involving Tori Van Dyne, who's the conservator of a mystery library. She's your narrator. Then she comes face to face with a time-traveling ghost of Agatha Christie. Maybe, possibly, exactly.
Perhaps.
And first of all, I think the idea is really brilliant. The book is I would completely recommend it. It's a lot of fun to read. And what I was wondering is, first of all, what inspired you to write this book, if you've always been an Agatha Christie fan? But secondly, were you ever tempted to tell any of it from Agatha's point of view?
Okay, well, I will, no. There. We've done question two. I'll go back to question one. No, question two is complicated, and I will get there. We're all saying the same thing. 10 or 11 years old, we started to read these people whose books became our touchstones. And even Charles Dickens, I did, yeah. And so that happened to me, and really it's all my grandmother's fault. She was a very, very bossy lady, and she loved books, and she particularly loved poetry. She loved Emily Dickinson and Emily Dickinson's poetry. And what she did was she wanted to recreate Emily Dickinson's personal library because she wanted to understand how her mind worked. So she collected her works as well, but it was these books, and she put them in this little room in her house. And I was young, I was over-imaginative. Now I'm old and over-imaginative. And I just had this visions of sort of Emily coming for tea, and they'd both sit in that room and discuss Emily's mind. And it kind of never left me. And then there was Agatha, Mrs. Christie, the Queen of Crime. She's classic. She's just always been a favorite of mine. I love Golden Age mystery. But I particularly liked her books. And I particularly liked her sense of humor, which I don't think people really talk about or think about that much. But the lady is damn funny. And so I had this idea, and I knew that her father was American, that he was born and raised in New York City. I knew that she traveled here several times and loved the city. So I thought, you know what? I love the city. I've lived in the city. I love Agatha Christie. Maybe we can do something with this. So I had this idea about this Tori Van Dyne, who is not your normal protagonist. She's kind of screwed up. She's got trauma in her life. She's very, very reserved. She's very snarky in her head, but not out loud. And I just sort of thought, okay, she's a book conservator. She's living in this building, long story, with this small private library, which New York has quite a few of, devoted to crime fiction. And then one day she goes into the Agatha Christie room, which, surprise, is an exact replica of Agatha Christie's personal library at Greenway House in Devon. And there's this woman sitting there. And this woman announces that she is Agatha Christie on holiday from the great beyond, and she's there to help solve a mystery. And Tori's like, yeah, not on my time, you're not. You know, crazy fangirl, okay, this is not a good thing. At any rate, guess what? A murder happens. Guess what? This so-called Mrs. Christie is pretty darn good at figuring out what's going on. So I loved this idea, took it to my editor. They loved the idea. And so I went forward with this. Now, I guess, so question 2, right? So tell me exactly what you want me to do about question 2.
Were you ever tempted to, I don't think my thing, I'll just talk loud. Were you ever tempted to write the book, part of the book or all of the book from Agatha Christie's point of view?
No. First of all, I did, again, we've all done it, a lot of research, and I really wanted, I wanted to know her voice in my head. I wanted to know her. So I read all the biographies and the endless discussions about what happened during the 2 weeks that Agatha disappeared and blah, blah, blah. My feeling is, I don't care. It's none of my business. You know, the woman was shy. She was private. I am not here.
She was clearly time traveling during those 2 weeks.
So, yes, exactly. She was busy. She was going on holiday. So at any rate, so no, I didn't want to be Agatha Christie. I didn't want to write it from her point of view. I just wanted her to be in that room and be Agatha Christie and then see her from, you know, a modern day perspective, which is, you know, really, you got to convince people, and this girl was not convinced. So I'd much rather do it from Tori, because Tori's snarky, and she's funny, and she's weird, and I thought, oh, I can do that voice. That's easy. So no, I didn't want to do Agatha's voice, which, if you read her, you know, her autobiography is absolutely charming. She talks about how very, very shy she was, crippled by shyness. You know, when she was offered the presidency or the chairmanship or whatever of the Detectoring Club, what was it called? We know it's, you know, with Dorothy Sayers and all of the greats. She only accepted under the condition that she did not have to give a speech. She's really, really shy, very, very private. But so funny. There's a wonderful memoir that she wrote, Come Tell Me How You Live, about the first dig that she went on with her second husband, Sir Max Mallowan. Very, very funny. Oh, and if you write mysteries, people, you've got to get Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, which is a compilation of her. She kept 76 notebooks. Now, she wrote 67 novels, and she wrote numerous plays, and she wrote as Mary Whip. 76 notebooks just filled with her thoughts of each book as she was writing. And it is the primer for writing a mystery. I can't do it her way, because, quite frankly, there are times where she's got 7 really good suspects, and she doesn't even know who done it. You know, she's still working it out. Absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to know her, but I didn't want to be inside her head talking. It's a modern book told from a modern perspective. It is a murder mystery. It is, as Steven Spielberg would say, Steven Spielberg loved Agatha Christie, and he used mysteries a lot in his plays. But he talked particularly about Agatha Christie, and he said, and this is a very rough quote, you know, the kinds of things where you know that in the end, everything will be explained. It will all make logical sense, and it will be a defense against chaos. And I think, well, if we need some defending against chaos, people, this would be the time. So that's what I hope I've done, defended against the chaos.
Well, you definitely have.
Thank
And
you.
I don't even know why I'm using this thing. Can you hear me at all? You can hear me now. Okay, great. I was shown the 10-minute card, so I'm wondering if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists. No? Okay. Oh, yes.
Just because you're talking about, can you guys hear me? Okay. So the question is the use of biblical tropes and references throughout history, because in many cases the Bible is used as a source of demonization of Jews. And I, being an Italian American, I've grown up with being a stereotype that, you know, who do you know somebody who knows somebody kind of thing. So since the Bible is also the source of this crime, but also used as a source of discrimination and blame, how do you balance that in what you've been doing in both your cases? And you're the case of fictional, and yours more dealing with the review classical.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Bible, like every other book, it's all in how you read it. And I don't think it's fair to say the Bible is necessarily the source of bigotry. I think we're the source of bigotry. And I talk about this a lot. I have a podcast, and it drives me nuts to see this rise in anti-Semitism that's coming. You know, I always knew it would come back. I knew, you know, I wrote a book a long time ago in which I called this generation Holiday Jews, because the Holocaust was so shaming to people that they actually held back a little bit on the anti-Semitism. That memory is fading. You know, grass grows over every grave, no matter how big it is. And I think that as it fades, it comes back. And I truly, truly believe that anti-Semitism is a deep spiritual sickness. And, you know, I sometimes even Jewish people get upset when I say this, but I really think it's a hatred of the God that is in all of us, and that I think the Jews represent in people's imaginations, whether they do personally or not. And I think it's all, whenever, I call it the devil's flagpole, because whenever it shows up, you know something has gone terribly wrong with our society, and I think it's showing up right here, right now.
What I really like in your question is how do you wrestle with a text that has, you know, things that are incredibly influential in it, and also things that are troubling and problematic in it. And I think that's something that all of us in our reading every day encounter and have to kind of come up with our own decisions for what do we want to do with a text that has left such a mark on society. And maybe not all of that mark is good. I think that's not exclusive to Oliver Twist. That's not exclusive to anti-Semitism. That we experience that in sexism and racism and all kinds of things. I specialize in classic literature. If you want to point me to one classic text that doesn't have something problematic in it, I will personally give you $200. Like, it's very hard to find.
Including Agatha Christie.
Yes, including Agatha Christie. And I think that's something that it's important for us as readers and as writers to acknowledge and to be aware of. But what I get so angry and uncomfortable with is that so many times the discussions I have are, is this book anti-Semitic? Is this book racist? Should we get rid of this book? Should we no longer teach this book? And what I always say is any solution to a problem that begins or ends in book banning is the wrong solution. I think we should always be encouraged to read these touchstone texts and really engage with the problems that they have, because those are the problems that society has. Those are the problems that we have all had historically. What I think the answer is not to say don't engage with it, don't work with that text. It's think about that text in conversation with other texts. And so that's what I was trying to do with Fagin the Thief, is not to say Oliver Twist is a racist, anti-Semitic, sexist book that no one should read. It is a book that has racism and anti-Semitism and sexism in it, and also has some of the most beautiful language in English history, and it's done some really incredible things for, social reform and economic justice. Let's think about all of those things together and think, what is the composite story that this tells us about people? I think that's more important and more valuable than dividing things between good and bad.
Any other questions? Yeah, do we have time for, yeah?
Oh, thanks, Jen. So my question is, maybe all of you or some of you could speak to literary influence, because all of the novelists are talking about being influenced by Christie or Dickens, but then these are writers who are also incredibly original. So then, how are they influenced? And I think about who is Elmore Leonard seems so original, and we all look to him, and a lot of us are writers who are trying to emulate writers we like, but we also want to be original. And then for Richard, this came because I was going to ask just the original germ of this to say, what was Poe's relationship with Charles Brockden Brown, and was he reading Brown and aware of Brown in the same, I guess in the same way was Hawthorne reading Poe, right? So anyway, so that's the question.
So, did you guys understand the question?
So are you sort of asking what authors influenced the authors that we're influenced by? Was that the?
Use that as a mirror for your own thinking about your own creative.
Okay. Well, certainly, I can speak, I guess, to Agatha Christie. She modernized the detective story, is what she did. She made it current. She was.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So she was taking Wilkie Collins and making it short, fast, fun. Very, very clever, and you never can guess. Same thing with Sherlock Holmes. It just let's move it along. So yes, she was definitely influenced by them. But I think more. You probably have more.
I was going to add that Poe certainly influenced Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible. Brockden Brown, as you mentioned, in a story called A Tale of the Ragged Mountains. He was also influenced by the popular culture. And part of the argument I make in my book is that The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first modern short story detective story, came from the newspapers. There were 14 stories in a newspaper that he transformed. And we don't remember the newspaper anymore or the articles in the newspaper, but we remember the Murders in the Rue Morgue. So I think the test of drawing from another writer is, did you make something greater? And in Poe's case, oftentimes he did.
I actually think we're done. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. This has been great.